Hi there. Welcome back. Every story you hear is not just about the past, but also a way to feel, to understand, and to grow your English naturally. So stay with us till the end, listen, feel, and let the stories of time guide your English journey. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell to travel through history with us. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, origins and upheaval. 1945–1979. Prelude to invasion, December 1979. On Christmas 1979, Soviet tanks rumbled across the Afghan border toward Kabul, while helicopter units secured the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. In Moscow, the Politburo had decided to intervene to prevent the collapse of Afghanistan's communist government. Across the countryside, armed insurgents had already risen against the unpopular regime, and much of rural Afghanistan was outside government control. Even as Red Army commanders doubted they could subdue such a vast and hostile land, the Kremlin pressed forward, determined to preserve its influence in the region. Afghanistan before the storm, 1945–1963. In the decades after World War II, Afghanistan remained a crossroads of empire and instability, but under King Zahir Shah, it experienced relative calm. His monarchy pursued modest modernization while carefully avoiding reforms that might provoke conservatives. Zahir Shah's government improved infrastructure and expanded education, but also cracked down on those who pushed for rapid change, including Afghan communists who maintained contacts with the Soviet KGB. During this period, Kabul sought to balance between superpowers. Officially non-aligned, Afghanistan accepted aid from both blocs. Soviet engineers built roads and dams, while American and West German experts joined development projects. The American anthropologist Louis Dupree later observed that in provincial towns, Soviet and American advisors often lived in remarkable comfort, enjoying modern apartments, commissaries, private theaters, and even Olympic-sized swimming pools. Such aid fueled urban modernization and created a small middle class, though the countryside remained deeply traditional and resistant to reforms such as women's education. A new political climate. 1964, 1973. In 1964, King Zahir introduced a liberal constitution allowing political parties, inadvertently unleashing competing ideologies. Universities in Kabul became hubs of political ferment. Monarchists, liberals, Islamists, and communists all jostled for influence. Among the communists, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, emerged as the main Marxist organization. Its founders Nur Muhammad Taraki, Hafizullah Amin, and Babrak Karmal admired the Soviet transformation of Central Asia and worked closely with KGB agents. While they publicly promoted gradual reform, their true ambitions were revolutionary. However, their influence remained confined to a small urban elite and segments of the Soviet-trained military. By 1967, ideological and ethnic rifts split the PDPA into two factions: Taraki's hardline cult group and Karmal's more moderate Parkam faction. The divisions weakened communist influence, while Islamist intellectuals gained traction in opposition. Many Islamist thinkers sought a modern interpretation of Islamic governance rather than radical fundamentalism. The monarchy even encouraged these groups to counter the rise of Marxism. One major Islamist organization, Jamiat-e-Islami, emerged from Kabul University, preaching a conservative but modern vision of Islam inspired by Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. Regional tensions and shifting alliances, 1960 seconds, 1970 seconds. Afghanistan's foreign relations also evolved amid Cold War rivalries. In 1960, Afghan forces supplied by Moscow clashed with Pakistan over Pashtun tribal territories straddling the border. Pakistan, already entangled with India, desired a neutral Afghanistan as a buffer state. Meanwhile, Kabul continued to request aid from both sides of the global divide. Although officially non-aligned, it leaned heavily toward the Soviet Union for military and technical assistance. Despite decades of modernization, Afghanistan's progress lagged behind that of other developing countries. By the early 1972s, King Zahir's cautious approach frustrated reformists while angering conservatives. His reluctance to democratize or curb corruption fueled discontent across the political spectrum, setting the stage for upheaval. Daoud Khan's coup and authoritarian rule, 1973–1978. In 1973, Mohammad Daoud Khan, the king's cousin and former prime minister, overthrew the monarchy in a bloodless coup while Zahir Shah was abroad. Declaring himself president, Daoud initially relied on moderate communists, particularly the Parcham faction, to consolidate power. Soon, however, he turned against them, purging leftists from government and the military. Daoud sought to rule as a nationalist strongman, promising reform while silencing all opposition. His secular modernization and centralized control angered Islamist groups, many of whom fled or went underground. Pakistan's intelligence agency, the Inner Services Intelligence (ISI), began training and equipping Afghan Islamist dissidents, hoping to pressure Kabul. After a failed Islamist uprising in 1975, Daoud responded with brutal repression, imprisoning, executing, or exiling hundreds. Survivors escaped across the border into Pakistan, where they were sheltered by Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government. One participant, former engineering student Mohammad Ishaq, recalled fleeing through the Panjshir Valley's freezing mountains, surviving with little food or clothing as comrades died of cold. Despite domestic unrest, Daoud sought to diversify Afghanistan's foreign ties. He requested intelligence from Washington about Soviet activities while negotiating economic agreements with Moscow. He also improved relations with Iran and Pakistan. Yet Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev worried that Daoud's defiance threatened Moscow's decades-long influence. During a tense 1977 meeting in Moscow, Brezhnev warned Daoud about alleged NATO spies in northern Afghanistan. Daoud sharply replied, "Afghanistan is a free and independent country. We will not tolerate anyone telling us who may or may not work here." His bold stance marked a clear shift away from Soviet dependency. The Saur Revolution, 1978. In April 1978, the assassination of a prominent communist activist triggered mass demonstrations in Kabul. Daoud's decision to arrest PDPA leaders backfired. By now, the party had reunited its factions and infiltrated the armed forces with KGB assistance. Disillusioned army officers and PDPA operatives launched a coup. On the 27th of April 1978, tanks rolled through the capital as jet fighters roared overhead. After fierce battles, Daoud and more than 1,000 of his supporters were executed. A 15-year-old Afghan recalled listening to Radio Afghanistan that morning as it announced victory for the revolution of the 7th of Saur, instructing schoolchildren to cheer before sending them home early. When he told his father, the older man replied, "God bless us, the future is not good." The coup, known as the Saur Revolution, shocked both Washington and Moscow. Each suspected the other's involvement, though in reality, the PDPA had acted independently. Under the new Revolutionary Council, led by Taraki and Amin, Afghanistan became the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Revolutionary reforms and growing resistance, 1978–1979. The PDPA immediately launched sweeping reforms. Land was redistributed, women were granted equal rights, and education was expanded. However, these drastic measures collided with Afghanistan's tribal, religious, and patriarchal traditions. Resistance erupted almost instantly. Taraki's government portrayed its revolution as part of the global socialist movement, but insisted it would remain non-aligned. In his inaugural broadcast, Taraki declared that relations with all nations, including the Soviet Union, would depend on their support for Afghanistan's revolution. To Pakistan and the West, this rhetoric signaled danger. Islamabad, already wary of a pro-Soviet regime on its border, began supporting Afghan Islamist militants, soon to be known as the Mujahideen, with backing from Iran's Shah, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. The Soviet Union, though initially cautious, extended $250 million in military aid and dispatched more advisors to Kabul. Yet Moscow grew alarmed at the PDPA's internal purges and reckless policies. Taraki's radical Khalq faction turned on the moderate Parchamites, exiling figures like Babrak Karmal. The regime's brutality, including mass executions, torture, and imprisonments, alienated the population and deepened the insurgency. The communists viewed traditional leaders, tribal elders, mullahs, and landlords as feudal remnants obstructing progress. The Soviets advised moderation and political compromise, urging Taraki to divide and conquer his enemies rather than wage total war against society. Taraki, however, refused to soften his stance. Denouncing his opponents as agents of colonialism who conspire under the mask of religion, he tightened repression instead of seeking reconciliation. Conclusion: on the edge of invasion. By late 1979, Afghanistan was in chaos. The countryside had risen against the regime, cities were seething with fear, and the army was fracturing. The Soviet leadership, though initially reluctant, concluded that without direct intervention, their southern ally would collapse entirely. In December, Soviet paratroopers landed in Kabul, tanks crossed the northern border, and Afghanistan became the battleground for one of the Cold War's bloodiest conflicts. What began as an ideological rescue soon spiraled into a decade-long occupation that would drain the Soviet Union and devastate Afghanistan's future. The collapse of the Afghan Revolution and the Soviet decision to invade 1979. The regime turns on its people. By mid-1979, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, had unleashed a brutal campaign against its own population. Nur Muhammad Taraki, now the face of Afghanistan's revolution, denounced Islamists as cancerous tumors that must be uprooted from the body of the nation. His words in the Kabul Times set the tone for a campaign of terror. The secret police, aided by Soviet advisors, targeted village mullahs and their families. Arrests, torture, and executions became routine. Instead of quelling dissent, the repression ignited fury. In the countryside, resistance flared everywhere. Local uprisings spread through the north and east, and Islamist insurgents began calling themselves Mujahideen, those who fight for God. They portrayed themselves as defenders of Islam and the Afghan people against atheistic tyranny. The government's answer was even more violence, carried out by the PDPA's Interior Ministry, the KGB-supported KAD intelligence agency, and Serendoi paramilitaries. Within the leadership, divisions deepened. Taraki's once loyal protege, Hafizullah Amin, now sought to eclipse his mentor. Their rivalry split the already weakened PDPA at a time when the regime could least afford instability. Uprisings and crisis in 1979. In February 1979, Afghanistan's crisis took an international turn when U.S. Ambassador Adolph Dubs was kidnapped in Kabul by unidentified gunmen. Afghan forces, assisted by KGB agents, launched a chaotic rescue attempt that ended with Dubs's death. Washington immediately suspended all aid to Afghanistan, isolating the PDPA from Western support. The worst blow came the following month. In March 1979, the city of Herat erupted in rebellion. A full Afghan army division mutinied rather than fire on protesters. Crowds stormed government buildings, killing suspected communists and lynching Soviet civilian advisors and their families. Kabul dispatched reinforcements, which responded with overwhelming brutality. The uprising was crushed, leaving between 3,000 and 25,000 dead, the largest massacre of the revolution so far. Another rebellion in Kunar province ended in tragedy at the village of Karela, where 640 people were executed. 16-year-old Mohammed Ashaq recalled, "My father told me to run. I reached the mosque and heard gunfire behind me. From there, I saw soldiers take men to another field and shoot them." Taraki's government was losing control. In desperation, he appealed to Moscow for help. Almost nobody supports the government. In Kabul, we have no workers, only craftsmen. If Herat falls, the revolution is doomed. Uprisings have spread throughout the country, and our army is too small to pacify them all. But Soviet leaders were appalled by Kabul's conduct. One Politburo member remarked bitterly, "We gave them everything, and what came of it? Nothing. They executed innocent people for no reason and told us that Lenin did the same. What kind of Marxists are these?" Even the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, opposed military intervention. He warned that Afghanistan was too undeveloped to sustain socialism and that only massive force could preserve the revolution, an approach, he argued, that would be disastrous for the USSR. Amin's rise and the final split. After the Herat uprising, Hafizullah Amin became prime minister, though his alliance with Turaki soon collapsed completely. Both men continued to request Soviet aid, and Moscow reluctantly provided T-62 tanks, Mi-24, a helicopter gunships, and hundreds of military advisors, but still refused to send combat troops. Meanwhile, the Mujahideen grew stronger. Soviet radio intercepts recorded their voices, boasting, "The Russians have joined the Afghan war. They've been in Panjshir, Paktia, and Konar. Some of their advisors have been killed." Moscow's patience with Amin evaporated. Soviet leaders blamed him for the massacres and chaos, and they distrusted him for having studied in the United States. In September 1979, they informed Turaki of plans to remove Amin from power. Turaki attempted to arrest or assassinate him, but Amin escaped and retaliated. Turaki was suffocated with a pillow, his mentor's death paving Amin's path to absolute power. The coup deepened Afghanistan's descent into civil war. 40% of the Afghan army deserted, leaving barely 60,000 troops, while some 40,000 men joined the Mujahideen. Insurgents now controlled 4 provinces outright and large parts of a dozen others. Amin sought to ease his isolation by reaching out to the United States and United Kingdom, declaring an interest in improved relations. But both governments distrusted him. His overtures only heightened Soviet paranoia. The KGB even concluded, mistakenly, that Amin might be a CIA asset. By autumn, the Soviet Union began quietly deploying more personnel, an airborne battalion to Bagram airfield, small troop contingents in Kabul, and additional officers to train Afghan units. Officially, these were protective deployments. In reality, they were preparations for something far greater. The Politburo decides on invasion. By early December 1979, Andropov reversed his earlier hesitation. He now argued that intervention could defend the gains of the April Revolution and restore Leninist principles in Afghanistan's leadership. On December 12, the Politburo made a secret decision. Amin would be overthrown, and Babrik Karmal, a moderate Parchamite living in exile in Czechoslovakia, would take his place. The USSR would send troops to secure the regime and protect against possible interference from Iran or Pakistan. At the decisive meeting, the Soviet chief of the General Staff, Nikolai Ogarkov, warned, "We will alienate the entire Muslim East and suffer global political damage." Andropov interrupted sharply. "Focus on military matters. Leave political decisions to us, to the party, and to Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev." Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov gave verbal orders to mobilize an invasion force. The plan called for the creation of the 40th Army, comprising 2 motorized rifle divisions and an air assault regiment, roughly 52,000 troops for the initial phase. Under Operation Baikal 7-9, an additional airborne division and regiment would airlift directly into Kabul and Bagram, seizing key government buildings. The first wave alone would deliver 7,700 soldiers, 894 vehicles, and over 1,000 tons of ammunition. Around 2,000 Soviet personnel were already stationed in the capital area. The invasion, Soviet planners insisted, would be a temporary 6-month deployment merely to stabilize the situation while the new Afghan government took charge. Amin's final days. On December 22, Soviet Ambassador Fikryat Tabayev informed Amin that Soviet troops would officially enter Afghanistan within days. Amin, desperate for help, welcomed the news. He believed he was gaining the reinforcements he had begged for. "Comrade Stalin showed us how to build socialism in a backward country. It's painful at first, but afterward everything turns out fine," he declared confidently. What he did not realize was that Moscow had already sentenced him to death. The Red Army's invasion plan was extensive. Troops would enter from both the northwest and northeast, advancing along the Ring Road connecting Afghanistan's major cities, ironically built years earlier with American and Soviet assistance. On December 25, Soviet armor rolled across the border. One column seized Mazar-i-Sharif and Kunduz before pushing toward Kabul, while helicopters secured the Salang Pass through the Hindu Kush. Another force moved from Herat toward Kandahar. Meanwhile, Soviet airborne units prepared to take control of Kabul's key installations. Hidden within their ranks were elite special forces preparing for a far more secret mission, the assassination of Hafizullah Amin. Operation Storm 333, the assassination of Amin. For weeks, Soviet special forces had gathered in Kabul under the guise of protection units. The plan was directed by GRU Colonel Vasily Kolesnik and coordinated between military intelligence and the KGB. The elite Muslim battalion, composed of soldiers from Central Asian Soviet republics, had flown in on December 10. Officially, they were assigned to guard Amin, a convenient cover for their true role in the upcoming coup. 2 KGB commando groups, Zenit and Gram, joined them, along with a company of airborne troops, about 560 men in total. Their Central Asian appearance and Afghan-style uniforms were meant to make them blend seamlessly with local forces. The plan was complicated when Amin relocated to the heavily fortified Tajbeg Palace on December 16. Soviet advisors, who provided part of his security, quietly obtained the palace's defense layouts. The site was formidable, perched on a hill, surrounded by minefields, with nearby Afghan army barracks, 3 T-54 tanks, and additional anti-aircraft guns. Roughly 2,500 Afghan troops defended the area. The Soviet assault was divided into 12 battle groups, BGs. BG-1 was tasked with neutralizing the Afghan tanks. BG-2, the main assault force, would storm the palace along the main road using 6 armored BMP vehicles. BG-3 would flank from the west, while other groups suppressed nearby barracks, anti-aircraft positions, and communication nodes. Support teams provided covering fire with Z, S, U, 2, 3, 4 Shilka guns and grenade launchers, while medical and recovery units waited nearby. The Operation Storm 333 commenced on the 27th of December, 1979. At that moment, Amin still believed the Soviets were his allies. He announced, "Soviet divisions are already on their way. Paratroopers have landed in Kabul. All is going well. I'm in constant contact with Comrade Gromyko. We're discussing how best to inform the world about Soviet assistance." Just hours later, the KGB attempted to poison him with a cola drink, but Amin survived. Across Kabul, Soviet agents sabotaged communications and logistics, cutting telephone lines, disabling tanks, and spreading confusion among Afghan troops. As darkness fell, Soviet armored vehicles advanced on the Tajbeg Palace. The revolution that began with promises of liberation would end that night in blood, as Soviet bullets ended Amin's short and violent reign. Within hours, Babrak Karmal would be flown in from exile to proclaim a new government, one that owed its survival entirely to Moscow's guns. Conclusion: by the end of December 1979, Afghanistan was no longer an independent state, but the newest front of the Cold War. The Soviet invasion, meant to secure socialism in a neighboring ally, instead ignited a decade of relentless warfare. What began as a limited operation of 6 months would stretch into 10 years of occupation, resistance, and ruin, a conflict that would bleed both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union to exhaustion. Operation Storm 333 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, December 1979, early 1980. The fall of Amin and the assault on Kabul. As Soviet forces poured into Afghanistan, additional paratrooper and mechanized units fanned out across Kabul to seize key installations. Within hours, they occupied government ministries, the main prison, the post office, the general staff headquarters, and the central television and radio stations. They also stormed the secret police compound and the ministries of defense and interior, all crucial centers of power in the capital. Colonel Yevgeny Chernyshev, an officer with the airborne forces, described the chaos of that night in his diary. The movement of the paratroopers' convoy through the city could be tracked by the sound of gunfire. As our units approached the targets, tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The Afghan guards were ready to defend themselves. At the Tajbeg Palace, the Soviet assault ran into fierce resistance. Colonel Vasily Kolesnik, leading the attack force, had hoped for surprise, but Afghan defenders were on alert after the earlier failed poisoning attempt on President Hafizullah Amin. When Battle Group 1 engaged Afghan tanks, the gunfire raised a general alarm. At 7:15 p.m. Kolesnik ordered an all-out assault supported by artillery and anti-aircraft fire from Shilka guns. Afghan soldiers destroyed several Soviet armored vehicles from BG-2, forcing the attackers to continue on foot. At 7:40 p.m., Soviet troops stormed the palace's lower floors, battling Amin's bodyguards room by room. BG-3, approaching from the western side, suffered heavy losses but pressed forward under covering fire. Elsewhere, Soviet detachments pinned down loyalist Afghan units and destroyed the entrenched tanks guarding the palace perimeter. Colonel V.G. Salkin, a participant, later recalled, "First, KGB special units stormed the palace, then the Spetsnaz followed. The attackers shouted loudly, often profanities, to terrify the defenders. The fighting was fierce and merciless. If no one emerged from a room with hands raised, the doors were blown open, grenades tossed inside, and automatic fire followed indiscriminately. By the time the Soviets reached the upper floors, only 50 attackers remained. They killed Amin's bodyguards and eventually found Amin and his 2 sons, killing them in the crossfire. The entire assault lasted just 43 minutes. Soviet casualties were officially recorded as 9 dead and 69 wounded, though some accounts claim up to 100 fatalities. Around 200 Afghans were killed and hundreds more captured. After the raid, almost every participant in Operation Storm 333 was decorated for bravery. Colonel Kolesnik received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Within Soviet military history, the raid was remembered as a daring and technically flawless mission combining special operations, deception, and sabotage in a single synchronized assault. It became a celebrated case study at the Russian Airborne Academy for decades to come. The installation of Babrak Karmal. On the 28th of December 1979, the day after Amin's death, Soviet aircraft brought Babrak Karmal back from exile. Appearing on Afghan radio, Karmal promised to end the torture and executions that had defined the PDPA regime and to restore unity within the party. The broadcast, pre-recorded under Soviet supervision, omitted the fact that Amin's closest allies were being executed even as Karmal spoke. Afghans were unconvinced. Many saw Karmal as a Soviet puppet. Within weeks, a mass exodus began. By January 1980, more than 430,000 refugees had fled across the border into Pakistan. In less than 72 hours, the USSR had toppled a government, installed a new leader, and taken full control of its southern neighbor, a breathtaking display of military power, but also a plunge into a political and moral quagmire. The gamble and its consequences. The decision to invade Afghanistan, codenamed Operation Baikal 7-9, had been made hastily, with planning spanning only a few weeks. Even today, historians debate the Kremlin's true motives. Some argue it was a desperate attempt to preserve Soviet influence in a collapsing client state. Others see it as an overconfident extension of Moscow's Cold War reach. The invasion was risky. Afghanistan's long history of internal conflict, combined with its tribal and religious diversity, made it deeply unstable terrain. The Soviet Union lacked both the local knowledge and the linguistic skills to govern or even fully communicate with the Afghan population. Moreover, the intervention contradicted the USSR's self-image as a supporter of anti-colonial movements. At a March 1980 meeting, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko bluntly warned his colleagues, "Who will the Soviet army fight against? Against the Afghan people, first and foremost, and they will have to be fired upon. Everything we've achieved in détente, in arms control, and in diplomacy will be undone. It will be a gift to China, and all non-aligned countries will turn against us." Despite such warnings, Soviet leaders drew confidence from past successes. They had restored control in Czechoslovakia in 1968, intervened effectively in Ethiopia 1974, and helped consolidate socialist rule in Angola 1975. In Angola, the local communists had become a true vanguard party, leading their revolution with Soviet backing. Moscow hoped the PDPA would do the same in Afghanistan, a hope that soon proved disastrously misplaced. Soviet advisors and the decision-makers. Before the invasion, the USSR already had a large civilian and military presence in Afghanistan. Thousands of Soviet engineers, teachers, and Communist Youth League members worked alongside Afghan ministries and universities. Figures such as Ambassador Alexander Puzanov and KGB Lieutenant General Boris Ivanov, both longtime Moscow loyalists, were especially influential. Puzanov had been a personal friend of Nur Mohammad Taraki and a strong proponent of military assistance. Some historians suggest that Puzanov, Ivanov, and their allies helped sway Yuri Andropov, the KGB chief, who had initially opposed intervention. However, archival evidence remains incomplete. What is certain is that Amin's violent seizure of power in September 1979 and his outreach to the United States convinced the Soviet Politburo that he could not be trusted. The fear of losing Afghanistan to American influence, even indirectly, outweighed every other consideration: global reaction and the return of the Cold War. As Gromyko had predicted, the Soviet gamble triggered an international storm. Western governments immediately condemned the invasion. The United States and the United Kingdom saw it as a bold attempt to extend Soviet control toward the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. President Jimmy Carter delivered a sharp response in January 1980. The Soviet Union must answer basic questions. Will it pursue peace and stability, or will it expand its power far beyond its security needs and use that power for colonial conquest? Moscow must realize that its decision to use military force in Afghanistan will be costly to every political and economic relationship it values. Carter's administration moved swiftly. Economic sanctions were imposed. U.S. grain exports to the USSR were suspended, and the United States led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. More importantly, Washington decided to counter the invasion indirectly by strengthening the Afghan resistance. Some U.S. officials, including National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, speculated that Afghanistan might become the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Yet Brzezinski cautioned that the Mujahideen were weak, fragmented, and poorly armed. Unlike the North Vietnamese, they lacked strong international backers. Still, he believed the conflict could bleed Soviet resources and morale if the rebels received adequate support. The birth of the U.S.-Pakistan-Saudi axis. In early 1980, the United States formally adopted a new policy toward Pakistan, which now became the central hub for supporting the Afghan resistance. Brzezinski wrote in a memorandum, "We must both reassure Pakistan and encourage it to help the rebels. This will require revising our policy, more guarantees, more arms aid, and, regrettably, relaxing our non-proliferation concerns." This decision marked a dramatic shift. Washington began supplying Pakistan with military aid and intelligence support while turning a blind eye to its nuclear weapons program. CIA officer Howard Hart, stationed in Islamabad, urged expanding assistance from basic logistics to weapons deliveries. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, soon partnered with Saudi Arabia. Prince Turki al-Faisal, head of Saudi intelligence, saw supporting the Mujahideen as the best way to block Soviet expansion into the Middle East. Riyadh began matching U.S. contributions dollar for dollar, channeling funds through the ISI to Afghan resistance groups. A world condemns the invasion. At the United Nations, the response was overwhelming. The General Assembly voted to condemn the Soviet invasion, with support from many newly independent nations that had themselves once been victims of colonial domination. The spectacle of a self-proclaimed anti-imperialist superpower invading a non-aligned state shocked much of the world. UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, a former Austrian diplomat with a controversial wartime past, tried to mediate a settlement. But neither the Soviet Union, the new Afghan regime, nor neighboring Pakistan and revolutionary Iran showed interest in compromise. The Cold War's ideological and geopolitical front lines had shifted southward, and Afghanistan was now the battlefield. Epilogue: the beginning of a long war. By early 1980, it was clear that the Soviet Union had entered a conflict it could not easily control. Moscow's expectation of a 6-month stabilization mission had already proven delusional. The Afghan army remained unreliable. The countryside was in open revolt, and hundreds of thousands of refugees poured into Pakistan and Iran. The invasion marked the beginning of a decade-long war that would claim over 1 million Afghan lives, devastate the country, and drain Soviet strength in its final years. For the world, it signaled the end of détente and the return of confrontation between East and West. In retrospect, Operation Storm 333, that short, brutal night when Soviet commandos stormed the Taj Beg Palace, symbolized the turning point. The Soviet Union's most secret and efficient military strike became the prelude to its longest and most exhausting war. And that's all for today's journey through history and language. If these stories touched your heart, remember, every time you learn a new word, you're keeping a piece of history alive. So keep listening, keep feeling, and keep discovering the world through English. Thank you for staying with us until now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because next time, we'll travel even deeper into the past together. Until then, take care, keep learning, and never stop exploring the story of humanity.